Only a couple of months ago, it looked like the US economy was doing pretty well. Growth kept on coming in above expectations, inflation kept on coming in below expectations, and the stock market was at an all-time high. Today, that's all changed. Not only has US GDP growth apparently stalled, but inflation has also started ticking up again. And even Trump's allies have started warning that this economy might not be strong enough to cope with a prolonged increase in energy prices. So in this video, we're going to take another look at the US economy and explain why some economists have started warning about the risk of stagflation. On the night of the 2024 US election, Donald Trump told his supporters that God had saved his life for a reason, alluding to the assassination attempt on his life a few months earlier. In the latest issue of Too Long, we explore how faith-fueled populism, from Donald Trump to Vladimir Putin, has slowly been reshaping modern democracy. That's just one of 72 pages in the magazine, because as always, there's more to Too Long than you'd expect. Purchase your copy by clicking the link in the description. So before we get into it, a quick caveat. In making this video, we're not suggesting the US is necessarily headed for an economic crisis of the same magnitude as the 70s and 80s, which is when the term stagflation, a portmanteau referring to the combination of stagnant economic growth and high inflation, first really entered popular discourse. To give you a sense of how rough that decade was, in both 1975 and 1980, the US experienced a deep recession, while headline inflation was running at over 10%. At the moment, things don't look likely to get this bad, largely because the crisis of the 70s was a consequence of an oil shock. And whilst another oil shock looks very much on the cards, the US economy is less oil-centric than it used to be. For context, the so-called oil intensity of the US economy, which basically measures how much GDP is created per barrel of oil consumed, has fallen by 60% since the 70s, which suggests the US economy has become less dependent on oil and should thus be less affected by any oil shock. Nor are we suggesting that the US is uniquely exposed to stagflation-related risks. Here in the UK, for instance, things are looking pretty stagflation-y, especially if the ongoing increase in energy costs continues. However, what makes the US somewhat unique is the fact that, unlike in the UK, where stagflation has been on the cards for a while, not too long ago, the US economy looked like it was doing pretty well. The headline GDP figures in the second and third quarters of last year were very good, and whilst it's remained slightly above the Federal Reserve's 2% target, inflation didn't really spike in the way that many people expected it to in the wake of Trump's tariffs, which Trump and his supporters interpreted as proof that Trump was right and that mainstream economists were wrong. In the past couple of weeks, however, this has all changed, with both inflation and growth going very much in the wrong direction. Let's start with inflation. The key thing to understand here is that, in the US, inflation risks were already growing before the war in Iran and the subsequent spike in oil prices. In February, for instance, while CPI, which is the most common measure of inflation, came in at a manageable 2.4%, PCE, which is the Federal Reserve's preferred measure of inflation, came in at 3.1%, well above forecast and the highest since March 2024. Similarly, PPI, which measures inflation experienced by producers at the wholesale level and is usually a pretty good predictor of consumer inflation in the future, came in at 3.9%, the joint highest reading since February 2023. This data supports the theory that, contrary to what Trump and his supporters claim, tariffs are still inflationary. But the reason we didn't see a notable spike in inflation last year is that their inflationary effects were essentially delayed, largely because businesses were able to build up their inventories before the tariffs came into effect, but are now exhausting these stockpiles. Of course, the war in Iran and the associated energy crisis threatens to make this all a lot worse. Brent crude prices, which are the most popular benchmark for global oil prices, have already jumped to over $110 a barrel, roughly double where they were a year ago, largely because the threat of Iranian missiles and drones has deterred commercial ships from transiting the Strait of Hormuz, through which something like 20% of the world's oil usually passes. This increase in Brent crude prices arguably understates the severity of the crisis as well, because Brent crude essentially measures the price of oil being traded in the Brent complex, an oil market based around the North Sea. The Brent complex is a popular and liquid market, which is why it's the world's most popular benchmark, but it's been somewhat insulated from the recent chaos in the Middle East, because there's still some surplus oil floating about to cushion the blow. In Middle Eastern markets, however, where no such buffer exists, oil prices have gone even higher. In Oman, for instance, prices have gone above $170 a barrel, and in Dubai, they've gone above $150. As time goes on, the prices on these different markets should converge, which implies that, unless the Strait of Hormuz is somehow reopened, global oil prices could go a lot higher in the near future. As was made clear the last time energy prices spiked, back after Putin's invasion of Ukraine in 2022, an energy crisis can quickly morph into a more general inflationary crisis. This is essentially because energy is an important input in lots of other industries, which means that higher energy costs translate to higher prices across the board. For instance, energy accounts for a sizable fraction of all input costs in agriculture and manufacturing, which is why higher energy prices usually mean higher prices for food and manufactured goods like cars. This is why, according to Bloomberg data, markets currently expect the headline inflation rate in the US to reach 5.2% this year, up from about 2.3% in December. Again, this could all get a lot worse if normal service through the Strait of Hormuz doesn't resume and oil prices continue to rise. So you get the idea, inflation is on the up. This takes us onto the other component of stagflation, stagnant economic growth. Again, the US economy was already looking pretty stagnant before the war in Iran. GDP growth fell from an annualized rate of 4.4% in the third quarter of last year to just 1.4% in the fourth quarter, which was then revised down to just 0.7% earlier this month. Revisions to the jobs data have been similarly downbeat, and last week, Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell admitted that there has been effectively zero net job creation in the private sector over the past 6 months.
But the thing that I think a good number of people on the committee are concerned about is just the very, very low level of job creation. If you adjust what has been the trend job creation over the past, let's say, 6 months, if you adjust that for what we think, our staff thinks, is the overstatement due to overcounting, effectively there's zero net job creation in the private sector.
Again, this could all be made a lot worse by the war in Iran, because higher energy prices generally lead to reduced economic activity by reducing both consumer spending and business investment. A majority of economists, polled by the Financial Times, for instance, predicted that oil above $100 a barrel would knock at least 0.25 percentage points off headline GDP growth, while the odds of a US recession in 2026 have jumped from about 20% before the war to over 30% today, according to Polymarket. All in all, while a 70s-style crisis still looks unlikely, it's nonetheless true that the US economy doesn't look particularly well equipped to handle an energy crisis right now. As we mentioned earlier, the latest issue of our magazine, Too Long, is out now, which means that if you order a physical edition, it will be shipped to you immediately. And if you buy a digital edition, it will land in your inbox straight away. No pre-ordering, no waiting. Plus, if you subscribe while you're there, using the code SPRING26, you'll get your first copy for as little as £4.99, as well as 20% off every future issue as long as you stay subscribed. One other thing to know, though, is that if you're more of a listener than a reader, which would be fair enough, we are a YouTube channel after all, then this time round we've recorded every article in Too Long, with each of our writers doing their best audiobook impression while narrating their own articles. The New Age of Empires, written and read by Georgina Finley. If you want that, then you can sign up to our new Too Long and TLDR Party bundle. That gets you a copy of the magazine, and also access to TLDR Party on new subscription. Party members not only get access to the audio versions of every article, but they also get access to our documentaries, like our new series Leaders and Losers, and our upcoming documentary that we're recording in Greenland right now. They also get access to our behind-the-scenes podcast, The Bullpen, our bonus podcast, The Last Move, their name printed in every issue of our magazine, and more. Find out more about the TLDR Party by clicking the link in the description, while you'll also find a link to subscribe to Too Long and our documentaries.